Imagine a punishment designed not just to kill you, but to utterly break your body and spirit first. This is the story of Girolamo Savonarola, a man who faced the strappado, a torture that dislocated his shoulders and ripped his muscles, all before he was even led to the flames. The execution of Girolamo Savonarola was more brutal than you think, and every moment of it was by design. In the heart of Renaissance Florence, a city practically drunk on art, philosophy, and Medici family splendor, a different kind of voice began to echo. It was the voice of Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar who saw a city lost in sin. He wasn't charming, he had a hooked nose and eyes that burned with a dark fire, and his words weren't about beauty, but about brimstone. When Savonarola first came to Florence, the cradle of the Renaissance, he was horrified. He saw a city given over to what he considered pagan art, decadent luxury, and moral rot, all bankrolled by the powerful Medici family. He preached that Florence was a harlot and that its sins would bring down the wrath of God. "Behold," he thundered, "the sword of the Lord will descend suddenly and quickly upon the earth." At first, the sophisticated Florentines just ignored him. But Savonarola was relentless. He lived a life of extreme self-denial, and his conviction was absolute. His prophecies grew more specific and more terrifying. He foretold the deaths of popes and kings, and when Pope Innocent VIII died in 1492, just as he predicted, people started to listen. Then, in 1494, his most dramatic prophecy appeared to come true. King Charles VIII of France invaded Italy, his army a terrifying force marching south. As the French approached Florence, the city panicked. The ruling Medici, Piero, proved to be a useless leader and was quickly kicked out of the city. Terrified and leaderless, the Florentines turned to the one man who had seen this apocalypse coming, Savonarola. He actually met with the French king, pleaded on Florence's behalf, and convinced him to spare the city. Suddenly, the strange friar wasn't a fringe fanatic anymore. He was a prophet. He was the savior of Florence. With the Medici gone, Savonarola became the de facto ruler of the new Florentine Republic. He declared that Florence would become the New Jerusalem, a shining city of God. But this New Jerusalem had a steep price. All worldly vanities had to be destroyed. This led to one of the most infamous events of the entire Renaissance, the Bonfire of the Vanities. On Shrove Tuesday, 1497, in the exact same public square that would later host his execution, Savonarola organized a massive bonfire. His followers, including brainwashed bands of children, went door to door, collecting anything considered a vanity. Mirrors, cosmetics, fancy dresses, playing cards, musical instruments, and poetry books were all seized. Priceless works of art were torn from walls. It's even rumored that the great artist Sandro Botticelli, caught up in the religious fervor, may have willingly thrown some of his own masterpieces onto the pyre. All of these treasures were piled into a massive pyre and set ablaze, a towering inferno of forced piety. For a while, Florence was completely under Savonarola's spell, but his rigid control and end-of-the-world preaching started to create some powerful enemies. Chief among them was the Pope himself, Alexander VI, a member of the infamous Borgia family, and a man who was the poster child for the very corruption Savonarola preached against. The conflict started with politics. The Pope was trying to build a holy league to drive the French out of Italy, but Savonarola, who saw the French king as an instrument of God, refused to let Florence join. Enraged, Pope Alexander VI summoned Savonarola to Rome. The friar said no, claiming he was in poor health and feared he'd be assassinated on the way. The Pope's response? He banned him from preaching. Savonarola obeyed for a bit, but his power came from his voice. As his influence started to fade, he defied the Pope and got back in the pulpit, his sermons now more defiant than ever. In May of 1497, the Pope made his move. He excommunicated Savonarola for heresy, threatening the entire city of Florence with an interdict which would halt all church services if they kept protecting him. The city was now split down the middle. Savonarola's devoted followers, nicknamed the Piagnoni, or Weepers, still believed, but his opponents, the Arrabbiati, or the Enraged, saw their chance to take back the city. The breaking point came with a bizarre and fatal challenge, a trial by fire. A rival Franciscan preacher challenged Savonarola to prove God was on his side by walking through flames. Savonarola himself declined, but one of his most passionate disciples, Fra Domenico, accepted the challenge for him. On April 7, 1498, a massive crowd gathered in the Piazza della Signoria. 2 enormous pyres were built. The entire city held its breath, waiting for a miracle. But the miracle never came. The day was wasted with arguments over the rules. Just as the ordeal was about to finally begin, a sudden downpour extinguished the flames. The crowd, who had come expecting a divine show, felt cheated and furious. Their faith in Savonarola shattered in an instant. Public opinion, once his greatest strength, turned on him with vicious speed. This was the opening his enemies were waiting for. The very next day, a mob attacked the monastery of San Marco, where Savonarola lived. The siege was violent. His followers tried to fight back, but Savonarola just prayed, telling them not to resist. The doors were smashed open, and the friar was dragged out into the jeering crowds. Spat on and beaten, he and 2 of his closest companions were arrested. The prophet of Florence had fallen. Now he was just a prisoner. Before we get to the final brutal act of Savonarola's life, if you're finding this story of power, faith, and Renaissance brutality fascinating, do us a favor and hit that like button and subscribe for more dark history. It really helps us bring these forgotten stories to light. The trial of Girolamo Savonarola was never about justice. His enemies wanted a confession, and they were going to get it by any means necessary. His trial was really just a campaign of systematic torture, designed to destroy him physically and spiritually before he was even executed. He was subjected to the strappado. This torture was both simple and agonizing. The prisoner's hands were tied behind his back, and a rope was slung over a pulley. He was then hoisted into the air, his entire body weight hanging from his wrists, forcing his shoulder blades to wrench apart and his arms to dislocate. After hanging in this excruciating position, he would be dropped suddenly, the jolt sending waves of unbelievable pain through his body. Savonarola, a man who was already physically frail, was put through this multiple times. Under this unimaginable agony, he screamed out a confession, saying he was a fraud and that he had made up all his prophecies. But as soon as he was taken down and the fog of pain cleared, he would take it all back, insisting his visions were from God. This defiance just led to more torture. The ordeal left him a broken man. One of his arms was permanently useless, and the mere threat of being hoisted again was enough to make him collapse in terror. His final confession wasn't a statement of truth. It was a document forged from pain. On May 23, 1498, the final act unfolded. Savonarola and his 2 companions were led out into the Piazza della Signoria, the very stage of his greatest triumphs and failures. A scaffold had been built, with 3 nooses and 3 chains hanging over a huge pile of wood. The humiliation was as carefully planned as the pain. The 3 friars were publicly stripped of their Dominican robes, a ceremony meant to cast them out of the church and degrade them in front of the city they once ruled. They were hanged one by one. For his companions, death was not quick. It was a slow, agonizing strangulation. Savonarola was the last. He climbed the ladder, silent before the jeering crowd, and was hanged. But even death by hanging wasn't the end. The sentence for a heretic was to be completely erased from the earth. Fires were lit beneath the gallows. An eyewitness wrote about the gruesome scene that followed. The bodies burned slowly, and the crowd watched in horror as limbs fell off, consumed by the flames. At one point, the heat caused a muscle in Savonarola's arm to contract, making his hand lift in a gesture that some in the terrified crowd mistook for a final blessing, causing a panicked stampede. The cruelty was meticulous. When the fire finally died down, nothing was left but charred bones and ash. To make sure Savonarola's followers couldn't gather any relics and treat him as a martyr, the authorities ordered his remains to be collected. They were carted to the Arno River and unceremoniously dumped into the water, scattered by the current in a final desperate attempt to silence his voice forever. He warned Florence. They called him a prophet, and then they hanged him. They burned his body and scattered his ashes in the river, hoping his memory would drown. But memory doesn't sink that easily. A plaque in the Piazza della Signoria now marks the spot where he was executed, a quiet reminder of the city's most fanatical chapter. Girolamo Savonarola remains one of history's most complicated figures. Was he a righteous reformer, a true prophet killed for defying a corrupt church? Or was he a dangerous fanatic who terrorized a city with fear? His story is a chilling look at the thin line between faith and fanaticism, and a brutal reminder of how quickly a savior can become a sacrifice. The flames may have consumed his body, but the fire of his legacy, and the questions it raises about power, piety, and human cruelty, continues to burn. What do you think? Was Savonarola a saint or a sinner? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to explore more of history's most brutal and compelling stories, make sure you're subscribed. Thanks for watching.